On the 24th of October, 1918, the passenger liner, the SS Princess Sophia, ran aground on a reef in the waters off the coast of Alaska. Though heavily damaged, the ship survived, and other vessels in the area flocked to her aid. It would be more than 30 hours before the Princess Sophia sank beneath the waves, but a combination of factors would see that not a single one of her 340 passengers were rescued in time. The Princess Sophia was completed in 1912 in the shipyards of Paisley in Scotland. She was a sturdy vessel built of steel with a double hull and space for up to 500 passengers. She was well equipped too, with facilities that included a dining room to seat over 100 guests, a wood-panelled observation lounge, and a first-class lounge that had its own piano. She was also equipped with 8 robust steel lifeboats, as well as several traditional wooden ones. Although strong enough to survive the harsh conditions of the open ocean, the Princess Sophia was intended to serve the calmer waters of the Inside Passage, a long stretch of coastal passages and waterways that extends from Alaska all the way to Washington state. The Inside Passage is a relatively sheltered route, with many coastal islands providing protection to ships that sail there. The Princess Sophia was soon put to work on a route from Skagway in British Columbia to Victoria in British Columbia, sailing approximately every 2 weeks. On the 23rd of October 1918, she set off from Skagway on a routine sailing, with around 340 people on board, approximately 267 passengers and 73 crew. In command was 66-year-old Captain Leonard Locke. Locke was keen to make up time as the ship had departed 3 hours behind schedule. This delay was further exacerbated as weather conditions worsened. Within hours of her departure, the Princess Sophia was steaming through heavy snow, which reduced visibility to almost zero. Her crew resorted to navigating by sound, sounding the ship's whistle and calculating their location based on how long it took an echo to return. While this method of navigation was better than sailing blind, it was not sufficiently accurate to keep the Princess Sophia on course. Over time, she drifted further and further off course until, at 2 a.m. on the 24th of October, she ran aground on the rocks of Vanderbilt Reef. The ship was heavily damaged by the collision, with a large hole punched into her bow. It was a terrifying experience for passengers, many of whom immediately donned life jackets. In one case, a woman changed into a black morning dress in anticipation of her own imminent demise. However, the ship did not sink. Despite the damage, she was caught firmly on the rocks of Vanderbilt Reef. A wireless distress call was broadcast, and multiple ships converged on the scene, ready to help the stranded ship in any way they could. These ranged from small fishing schooners like the King and Wing to large military vessels like the USS Cedar. Regardless of their size or resources, though, the boats that came to the Princess Sophia's aid found themselves with very few options. At low tide, the Princess Sophia was surrounded by jagged rocks that prevented any other vessel from getting close. At high tide, these rocks were covered by water, but only just, meaning that they were still incredibly hazardous. It was feared that any attempt to launch a lifeboat from the Princess Sophia would end with this boat dashed to pieces on the rocks. Captain Locke hoped that risking an evacuation might not be necessary. He awaited the next high tide at dawn, hoping that the water would rise far enough to float the Princess Sophia off the rocks. When the waters rose, however, she remained firmly stuck in place. Later that day, crew from the waiting rescue boats attempted to launch lifeboats and get close to the stranded Princess Sophia. But Captain Locke warned them off. It would be safer, he said, to wait until the weather conditions improved. Unfortunately, the weather conditions did not improve. Indeed, they worsened. The wind and the waves grew steadily more powerful until several of the smaller rescue boats had to leave the scene to seek more sheltered waters. Even some of the larger boats, such as the USS Cedar, were struggling. Captain Ledbetter of the Cedar devised a plan to use a line launcher to shoot a rope across to the Princess Sophia, and then take passengers off one by one using a breeches buoy, a device that resembles a modern-day zipline. Unfortunately, the rising winds and waves meant that he could not anchor his ship in the stormy waters, and this plan had to be abandoned. The 24th of October became the 25th, and the Princess Sophia remained stranded on the rocks. The high tides had not refloated her, and every attempt to take passengers off her had been abandoned due to the dangerous conditions. As the weather got steadily worse and worse, even the larger rescue ships were forced to retreat. Sheltering in the lee of a nearby island, the captains of the Cedar and the King and Wing devised another plan. They would use the bulk of the Cedar to provide shelter from the wind, while the smaller King and Wing retrieved passengers from the stranded ship. It was a risky plan, but if the weather conditions improved, it should be possible. Before this plan could be put into action, at around 4:50 p.m. on the 25th of October, they received an urgent message from the Princess Sophia. "Ship foundering on reef. Come at once." Captain Ledbetter of the Cedar attempted to do just that, but the weather conditions he now faced were extreme. With almost no visibility, high winds and crashing waves, he was forced to turn back for fear of running into the reef himself. Meanwhile, the high winds and high tide had finally moved the Princess Sophia, but had damaged her catastrophically in the process. As she was lifted by the waves, rocks tore a massive hole in her hull, and she sank almost instantly. Oil from her engines lay thick on the water around her, meaning that even those passengers equipped with flotation devices stood little chance of survival. If they did not drown, they died from the effects of oil inhalation. By the time the weather had calmed enough for the rescue boats to approach the site, there was little left of the Princess Sophia. They saw only a vast oil slick, and one of her masts protruding from the water. Though they searched for survivors, only bodies were found. In total, the disaster took the lives of approximately 340 people. Only one living thing survived the sinking: a pet dog, who was found exhausted and coated with oil at a nearby harbour shortly after the sinking. For the rest of its life, the animal remained terrified of salt water. An investigation was carried out on behalf of the Minister of Marine and Fisheries. It was agreed that, with hindsight, the best option would have been to evacuate passengers as soon as possible. There had been a window of time on the day of the collision when the weather had not been too severe, and when it might have been possible to safely retrieve some of the passengers and crew from the Princess Sophia. Unfortunately, during this window of time, Captain Locke and the other captains had believed, quite reasonably, that the weather would soon improve, and there was no value in risking an evacuation that might end in tragedy when more favourable conditions might be just hours away. Though Captain Locke was criticised for not evacuating when he could have done, his decision was ruled as reasonable given what he knew at the time. Hundreds of bodies were retrieved from the water, along with the possessions of many passengers. During the day the ship had spent marooned on the rock, some had written letters to their loved ones. One such letter, penned by a man named John Maskell to his wife-to-be, Dorothy Burgess, was reprinted in several newspapers after the sinking, to give some insight into the plight of those stranded on board. There are now 7 ships near. When the tide went down, 2/3 of the boat was high and dry. We are expecting the lights to go out at any minute, also the fires. The boat might go to pieces, for the force of the waves are terrible, making awful noises on the side of the boat, which has quite a list to port. No one is allowed to sleep, but believe me, dear Dorry, it might have been much worse. I made my will this morning, leaving everything to you, my own true love, and I want you to give £100 to my dear mother, £100 to my dear dad, £100 to dear wee Jack, and the balance of my estate, about £300, to you, Dorry dear. John Maskell was buried in the Mountain View Cemetery in Vancouver. So were 66 other victims of the disaster. News of the sinking was overshadowed by news of the end of World War I less than a month later, and it soon disappeared from public memory. The wreck of the Princess Sophia, the place where more than 300 souls spent their final hours, remains on the sea floor near Vanderbilt Reef to this day. A beacon now stands upon the reef, and in the many years since the sinking, there has not been another similar accident.